Let me tell you something strange about a narcissist. We live in a world that warns us about them. We label them toxic, self-absorbed, manipulative. And yet, some of them walk into a room carrying a confidence so magnetic it almost feels like certainty. Here's the question that always lingers. What is that confidence hiding? It's easy to assume the story is simple. They love themselves too much. They care about status. They lack empathy. But that's not the full picture. Beneath the surface, there's an entire psychology at play. A fragile architecture of identity, a nervous system scanning constantly for validation, a self that was never allowed to feel small, so it learned to feel grand instead. See, for some people, narcissism isn't arrogance, it's armor. It's not an overflow of self-love, it's a defense against self-doubt so deep it cannot be touched directly. And this isn't about excusing harm. It's about understanding what grows in a psyche where worth once felt conditional. You've seen the pattern before. They dominate conversations. They redirect stories back to themselves. They need admiration the way lungs need air. Criticism doesn't land gently, it detonates. From the outside, it looks like ego, but watch closely. Notice how quickly admiration must be replenished, how silence feels threatening, how being ignored feels almost unbearable. Psychologists have found something fascinating. Beneath grandiosity often lies what they call a fragile self-concept, not a sturdy sense of I know who I am, but a shifting mirror that depends on reflection. It's identity crafting, constant, exhausting. In a culture that rewards visibility, narcissistic traits can look like success, confidence, branding, influence. But here's what's often misunderstood. It's not about loving the spotlight. It's about fearing what happens when the light turns off. Because when attention fades, something else rises. An old echo, an old wound, a memory of not being seen at all. For some, narcissism begins in contradiction, a childhood of excessive praise without emotional attunement, or the opposite, criticism so sharp that the child had to inflate just to survive. Maybe you were told you were special, but only when you performed. Maybe you were unseen unless you achieved. So you learned something subtle. Love is earned. Worth is proven. Visibility equals safety. And here's the paradox. The narcissist appears self-sufficient, independent, above the need for approval. Yet their inner world is organized entirely around it. That's what makes it confusing. Because underneath the grandiosity is often a terrified part that never felt securely mirrored. A child who didn't develop what psychologists call stable internal validation, an internal locus of worth. Instead, worth lives outside, in applause, in admiration, in comparison. And when your identity depends on external reflection, every interaction becomes a stage. Conversations turn into performances. Relationships turn into mirrors. Intimacy becomes threatening, because intimacy reveals imperfections. And imperfection, to a fragile ego, feels like annihilation. But let's pause here, because think about it. When was the last time you wanted to be seen? When did you hope someone noticed your effort, your talent, your presence? We all want reflection. We all want to feel significant. So where is the line between healthy self-regard and defensive grandiosity? Maybe it's not a line at all. Maybe it's a spectrum. And maybe, in certain moments, we've all leaned closer to one side than we'd like to admit. But not everyone who appears confident is driven by deep insecurity. Some narcissistic patterns are reinforced by culture itself. Because let's be honest, we live in an age of curated identities, personal brands, follower counts, metrics of worth displayed publicly. The system quietly rewards self-promotion. It amplifies performance. It monetizes attention. So what happens to someone already wired to equate visibility with survival? They thrive, at least on the surface. But here's the deeper layer. There are two faces of narcissism. One loud and grandiose, the other quiet and vulnerable. The vulnerable narcissist may not boast openly. They may appear sensitive, withdrawn, even anxious. But inside, the same fragile structure exists, a self that swings between superiority and shame. And this is where the paradox deepens. The narcissist may fear being ordinary more than they fear being disliked, because ordinary feels invisible, and invisible feels unsafe. There's a deep philosophical undertone here. In a world that constantly says, be extraordinary, choosing to be enough feels radical. But if your early environment taught you that enough was never enough, you may never stop striving, never stop curating, never stop polishing. And the longer someone lives this way, the more reality becomes filtered through self-reference. How does this affect me? How does this reflect on me? What does this say about me? Empathy becomes difficult, not because they lack humanity, but because their internal system is busy managing threat. Criticism isn't feedback, it's danger. Disagreement isn't dialogue, it's rejection. Studies show that individuals with high narcissistic traits often display heightened sensitivity in brain regions associated with social pain. Rejection activates alarm systems quickly. So the grandiosity functions like a shield, a psychological immune system. But shields also block connection, because intimacy requires mutuality, and mutuality requires the ability to sit with imperfection. Here's what's rarely said gently enough. Narcissism is lonely. Not always externally. There may be friends, followers, admirers, but internally it can feel like standing in a hall of mirrors where none of the reflections feel solid. So the next time you encounter someone who seems impossibly self-focused, you might ask yourself, what are they protecting? What collapse are they avoiding? And maybe, just maybe, you might also ask, where do I perform to feel safe? Because the desire to be admired is human. The fear of insignificance is human. The difference lies in whether your worth can survive silence. Maybe real confidence isn't domination. Maybe it's integration. A sense of self that doesn't crumble under critique. A presence that doesn't inflate under praise. Perhaps true self-esteem is quiet, stable, unimpressed with itself. Not because it thinks it's small, but because it doesn't need to prove it's big. And maybe that's what healing looks like. Not shrinking, not grandstanding, but softening. Allowing yourself to be seen without performance. Allowing yourself to be flawed without collapse. Because in the end, narcissism isn't about loving yourself too much. It's about not knowing how to love yourself without an audience. And maybe the bravest thing a narcissistic psyche can learn is how to exist unmirrored. To be in a room and not need to own it. To be in a relationship and not need to control it. To be in silence and not need to fill it. So if this reflection felt uncomfortably close or surprisingly compassionate, you can sit with that. You can leave a thought below, or you can leave it private. Because understanding doesn't require exposure. And maybe, just maybe, the most profound transformation begins not with admiration, but with honesty. In the end, we are not meant to be monuments. We are meant to be human.